Well, thanks very much. And it's great to be back in Canberra. I managed to get out here every couple of years, at least for the last many years, and I'm very happy to be back again. Is my talk going to come up here? There we go. Okay. Thanks. So what we're going to talk about is not only long-term demand, but long-term supply issues that are going to influence markets, global markets for food and food security worldwide. So what I'm going to do is talk first about what are some of the key drivers of agricultural growth and food security. I'll do a very brief description of the model we use in these long-term projections. Then I'll describe in a bit more detail our sort of baseline assessment of what's going to happen on supply, demand, and food security. And then look at a couple of alternative scenarios, and particularly ones I'm going to look at here on crop productivity and energy prices, to look also at how how specific alternative outcomes or specific alternative policies can influence those baseline projections for better or for worse. Then I'll end up with a few conclusions and policy implications. So let's go right in looking at the drivers. I think on demand side, I think we've already been hearing about this already, but we're going to have around 9 billion people in the world by 2050. And combined with that is a rapid urbanization process where we'll go up from about half of the population living in cities to nearly 80% by 2050. That's going to drive significant changes in demand patterns over time, together with rapid income growth, particularly in the rapidly growing developing countries, a shift away from basic staples such as rice and wheat into large increases in meat demand, which I'll be showing you in a moment, which also then, of course, drives a lot of demand for coarse grains like maize and also soybeans. There's also, it's been a hot topic for a number of years, but biofuels and bioenergy is now a little bit quieter in the public view, but we believe that's going to continue to be a strong demander for agricultural land and to some extent water, which will bid those resources away from direct food consumption. And in the longer term, you're also going to see, and you're wrestling with that here in Australia, significant demand for agriculture for greenhouse gas mitigation and carbon sequestration. Some of that is quite compatible with growth in agriculture production, such as things like minimum tillage practices, but others where we might even see shifts to large-scale farms, growing energy crops in particular, could also end up substituting for land. In the even longer-term land, I think will be more and more, there'll be constraints on land due to demands for conservation and biodiversity. On the supply side, I've already alluded to the water and land scarcity, and in fact, in addition to demand for biofuels, on the water side, there's very rapid growth in demand for non-agricultural uses of water, particularly for industrial uses and household consumption in rapidly developing countries such as India and China, so that we believe water will actually move out of agriculture in these major developing countries and into other sources, pushing the need for much greater efficiency of use in irrigation purposes. Climate change is going to be a big constraint or a big challenge, mostly after 2020 or 2030, but we see as much as, depending on the various scenarios you use, as much as a 10 to 20% reduction in yield potential by 2050, depending on, again, on the scenarios. Energy prices, increasing energy prices are influencing, again, the demand for biofuels. The higher the prices of energy, the bigger competition from biofuels. But also it significantly increases the costs facing farmers, both at the farm level and in transportation. To try to sort of counteract some of these sort of resource constraints, of course, there's a number of things that can be done. One of the keys that I'll talk about in more details is to increase the investment in agriculture research and other productivity-enhancing activities. Then also to improve science and technology policies, such as intellectual property rights, to make the expenditures on agriculture research more efficient. And also management reform at the farm level, where there's a number of things that can still be done in terms of farm-level improvements in productivity through integrated pest management, improved use of fertilizers, et cetera. So let's look at just very briefly at the model. The impact model was already mentioned. It's a representation of a global competitive agricultural market for crops and livestock. For a global model, it has pretty good resolution. We have 115 countries and regions. And then many of the larger countries are further subdivided by river basins with a total of about 280 units in which we analyze changes in supply. And we're now addressing 46 agricultural commodities. Just a very brief, this is maybe too much detail, but just to give you a little bit of idea what this is about. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner on the supply side, we do have straightforward area and yield supply functions, where of course you then have to define a large number of area elasticities and yield elasticities with respect to crop prices, labor and capital, and also some underlying productivity growth based on assumptions about the growth in agriculture research, investment in agricultural roads in developing countries, irrigation, and irrigation. Then you have also demand. The demand side in the upper left-hand corner where we have income growth and population growth projections and elasticities, so the propensity to consume food out of greater increases in income, which are linked not only to the growth, but also the proportion of demand, proportion of population, urban and industrial areas. Then going down to the middle, you see demand and supply projections are then influenced also by domestic price policies such as trade wedges and marketing margins, and further influenced by the availability and demand for water. So as we mentioned, there's a major water demand model that accounts for irrigation, livestock, domestic industry, and environmental purposes, and also tracks water supply based on renewable water, and effective water for irrigation and rainfed based on long-term projections of precipitation and long-term climate scenarios. Then the model sort of kicks in and solves annually on demand and supply, estimates net trade balances, and clears prices on an annual basis. So in fact, we can then track through the model annually, and of course here I'll be able to show you only a few selected results. So let's get right into it. So the baseline projections has a few key assumptions that are exogenous, and those have to do with annual growth in GDP, and here is showing the annual growth projections that we have for a number of regions. Starting on the left, you see East Asia and Pacific. We see in the longer run, we do see this lower rates than we have now, but still substantial rates of about 5.5% per year. We also see South Asia is growing at nearly 6% a year over time, as they increase their growth rates on a long-term basis. And a number of assumptions that we've had is that sub-Saharan Africa is now going to grow substantially. And in fact, we have been seeing in the last 5 years or so very significant growth rates in GDP in many of the major countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we expect that to be a very significant source of future growth of demand now as these countries have, again, a high propensity to consume food out of any additional income growth. See other parts of the world significantly slower, developed countries about 2.5%, developing about more than 4.5% per year, again, on a long-term basis. Population growth, we just really take the median population growth rates of the United Nations. As you can see here, in many areas, very low rates of growth, for example, East Asia and Pacific. Latin America, long-term growth rates are fairly low as well. The big outlier remains sub-Saharan Africa with over a 2% per year population growth. And again, that's going to contribute to this very large emerging market in Africa. So let's look then next at, these now are results that are mainly endogenous. So again, there is an exogenous component of this based on our assumptions about agriculture research investment. And as you can see here, we're projecting fairly slow growth in yield. So, and this is based again on our assessments of where investments are going right now. You can see this is also really a continuation of the trends. We can see the 1970 to 1990 values of crop yields for these crops. from FAO, and then the 1990 to 2010, which in general shows very dramatic fall off of growth, the one exception being soybeans. We project also that soybeans begins its fall off in crop yield growth during this period, but again, that's the kind of thing that is subject to further assessment. World crop area, on the other hand, is essentially going nowhere. So there's very little additional suitability for crops, so any expansion is typically in areas of lower productivity growth as well. The one exception is here we have maize and soybeans increasing the area, and that's mainly because of that demand for these crops for animal feed. Because of that, where we have still significant if slower growth in yields and almost no growth in area, you can see, in fact, that we are projecting on almost complete reliance on yield or productivity growth in the future to meet any demand needs. The only areas where you can see any significant growth over this period in area really Latin America, where Brazil and Argentina still have some significant, reasonably high quality land available for expansion, and Sub-Saharan Africa still has land, but not necessarily good land. Other regions, for example, you see East Asia and Pacific, we actually have a projected decline in area, which we're already seeing largely driven by declines in agriculture areas in China.